Today's story comes from a single mom who was in the hospital when her heart stopped beating. Then met her grandfather who died of stomach cancer, and he talked to her a lot. It eventually gave her a new perspective on life, so let's start today's story. I grew up with my grandfather when I was little. He was very kind to me and would leave me anything good in the house. Although the family was poor, my grandfather often made some toys for me himself. Looking back on my whole life, my childhood was the happiest period. When I was 23 years old, my grandfather died of stomach cancer, and I know he lived a very painful life in his last days. It was also one of my greatest regrets in my life, as I was working in another city and did not get to see him one last time. For many years after that, I blamed myself very much. I dreamed about him countless times. I had a failed marriage, which lasted for 5 years. It was an emotional and physical torture for those 5 years. There are no words to describe how I felt at that time. I ended up as a single mother living with 2 children. Although my ex-husband gave some support, we were still living on a shoestring. There was a time in the middle when I was very anxious and often had insomnia at night. My temper also became more and more irritable, and I often lost my temper with my children. My doctor prescribed me some prescription medication to help regulate my sleep and mental state. As time went on, I became dependent on this medication. Another thing happened that broke me even more. My landlord took out a mortgage on the house. The bank foreclosed on his house after he couldn't return it on time. The bank required us to move out within a set time frame. I can no longer find any other place I can afford. I didn't know what to do next. I bought some wine and went back to my room. I cried while drinking and I felt very helpless. After a while, I felt my stomach hurt. Then, it became harder and harder to breathe. While I was feeling this way, I texted my colleague, but I didn't remember anything about it. After he got the message, he kept calling me, but I didn't answer because I had passed out. He was worried about me, and when he got to my house he saw me lying on the kitchen floor. Then I was taken to the hospital. It was after 3 o'clock at night and my coworkers had been in the hallway of the hospital. When one of the nurses came out, my colleague inquired about my condition and the paramedic looked at my colleague and said, "You can only pray for a miracle because my heart has stopped beating." The doctors also assured me that they would not give up on me until the last moment. When I woke up again, I was standing in a farm with a wheat field across the street. Everywhere I looked, there was no end in sight. The sun was so warm. I found an old house, which was made of stone. As I tried to get closer to the house, I felt a person behind me. I turned around and I saw my grandfather who had died. I couldn't believe it and I screamed with excitement. I recalled every detail of him. He looked younger and more energetic than before. He was wearing a gray short sleeve and a farmer's hat. After we hugged, he took my hand and said, "Let's go inside." Before I even entered, I could smell the pea soup, a smell I knew all too well. I hadn't smelled it in years. It was my grandmother's favorite dish, and it was my favorite dish as a child. I was so excited inside, I felt like I was back to my childhood, back to that happy childhood. As I passed by the kitchen, I saw the garden outside the window, which was full of flowers and my favorite tulips. As I walked into the living room, I saw my deceased aunt, who smiled at me and welcomed me. Besides my aunt, the room was filled with my deceased relatives, some of whom I didn't recognize, but I knew were from our extended family. My grandfather took my hand and said, "Let's go sit outside, honey. Do you want to go?" It was so nice outside that I immediately said yes. When we got outside, we sat on a stone bench across from a wheat field that we couldn't see the end of. We stared at each other and smiled. He told me, "Don't feel guilty for not seeing him one last time." He wasn't angry because he understood my situation at the time. Then he held up his hands and said, "Isn't it amazing, my dear, that my fingers are clean?" He was a carpenter before, and no matter how much he washed his hands didn't look very clean. I will never forget the wooden horse he made for me, which was my favorite toy as a child. He also told me he was proud of me because he thought I was a competent mother. I don't know how to explain that after his death, I ended my marriage. He said he knew all about it. He pointed out my mistakes and said to me, "Don't give up, my dear, you will meet your true love, I promise." Then he took me to the garden. In the garden, he said to me, "In fact, I'm always there for you, you just can't see me. When you need me, you should be able to feel my presence." He was so against my drinking that he made me promise not to drink again. He went on to say, "I love you, honey, always remember that, and I'm glad to see you." Suddenly, I woke up in the emergency room. I could feel my heartbeat as I entered my body again. My colleague stayed with me in the hospital for 3 days, which touched me very much. It's been 9 years since this incident, but I can recall all the details as if it happened yesterday. I have chosen to forgive and forget about the people who have hurt me. It feels really good and I have a new perspective on life. By the way, I ended up getting married to my colleague and having our child. Although our life is very ordinary, but I am very satisfied with the life now.